Is Mr. Guest, the gentleman from Mississippi and the Vice Chair of the Committee on Homeland Security, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to point out what I highlighted last week when you testified. You came in your opening statement and you talk about your budget being insufficient. And you seek to place the blame on Congress that we're not giving you the resources and your department the resources that you need. But last year in the FY24 budget, which we just passed, Congress appropriated you $61.8 billion in discretionary spending, which was more than you asked for. And so Congress is giving you more money than you're asking for, but you're repeatedly coming into these hearings and you're trying to say that you don't have the financial resources that you need to carry out the job. Chairman Green mentioned the detention beds. The detention beds, which you and I talked about last week, are incredibly troubling. And the fact that you come in and you once again, you ask for less detention beds, significantly less detention beds than we funded in the FY24 budget. You told me in that hearing last week that you agreed with the Senate 50,000 detention beds, but yet you come in and you ask Congress only to fund 34,000 when we currently are funding 41,500. And you continue to seek to place the blame on us. I'm reading from the Physical Report 2023, ICE's annual report. In that annual report, Mr. Secretary, a report which is issued by your agency, on page 17, it says, congressional funding for ERO detention beds have remained relatively static for several years, and the detained population is limited as a result. In answering a question from Mr. Correa, you talk about the fact that the court says that there's been inadequate funding for detention beds. And so how do you come in here and you ask for less detention beds, but yet every time you testify, you try to place the blame back on Congress? Because we are actually funding more detention beds every year than you're asking for. And in a time in which we see a record surge of immigrants coming across the border, in a time in which you have at least now finally admitted that there is a crisis on the border, where we're seeing reports every day in the media about violent crimes committed by immigrants who are not in custody, who are not detained, but released into the interior. And yet you come in here and as a key part of your budget, you're asking for substantially less detention beds. And I find that especially troubling, Mr. Secretary, as I look at this, continue to look at the report that was provided by ICE, in which I see, according to the FY23 year-end report, that the non-detained docket, the docket that shows the number of non-detained individuals who you've allowed in the country, has now reached over 6.2 million people. 6.2 million. I spoke just yesterday with the ICE Director Lightliner. And in my conversation with him, I brought up the fact of what was in this report. And he told me, Mr. Secretary, that that number is now over 7 million, that report is old, that number is more than 7 million. Axios reported just several weeks ago that by the end of this fiscal year, FY24, October 1st, that number is expected to grow to 8 million. And so we see this record number of immigration, the record number of people that you, as the Secretary, are allowing to come into the country, but yet we're seeing you do nothing to ask for more detention beds. And I find that troubling. And I have to believe that I'm not the only member of this committee that finds it troubling that we're not asking for a sufficient number of detention beds. And Mr. Secretary, I also had the opportunity to ask you last week when you testified before the Appropriations Committee about this news article, a news article reported by Fox News. I provided you some of the content when we met last week, but I wanted to show this to you. And this is from an article dated January the 8th, 2024. It says, Mayorkas tells Border Patrol agents that above 85% of illegal immigrants have been released into the United States. It goes on there in the first paragraph. It says, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Monday admitted to Border Patrol agents that the current rate of release for illegal immigrants apprehended at the southwest border is above 85%. Said Mayorkas made the statements when meeting privately with agents, and that there were sources in the room who heard that. it goes on to say that there were at least 3 agents who verified to Fox News that you made that statement. And so, Mr. Secretary, did you make the statement that it was reported on January the 8th, 2024?
Congressman, as I mentioned to you last week, I do not recall that exchange in an internal meeting with the workforce, and let me assure you that the security of the southern border is our highest priority.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Thanadar, the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member of the